Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whenever you're listening to this. So, we have now moved on into week 5 of the fall 2024 semester. You have your first assignment behind you, and now we are ramping up towards the midterm. Like weeks previously, you'll see this video in the slot for week 5, and it'll be another short that has in the comments a link to the broader lecture. So I've been sharing shorts for the sake of time saving, and hopefully you can get into the comments so that you can also see the relevant sections in the course playlist for more videos on the subjects that I'm discussing that are straight out of your textbooks. So speaking of the midterm exam and your textbooks, I've updated the midterm exam section to show you that there are specific pages that I've been discussing and talking about in the lectures. And so these are your reading assignments up to the midterm. So a student had reached out to me and asked if there would be a study guide, and I decided that I would just consolidate the readings all into one convenient section for you, listed straight under the midterm. Also, for your convenience, I recorded a video on the writing assignment that will be due the same week as your midterm. You'll be studying the same material for your midterm that you should be using in your writing assignment. I want to let you know that I am your sole audience for your writing material that you'll be producing for this course. So you need to make sure that you are writing for your audience in all cases. In this class, as your instructor, I'm looking for your learning of information and material that I've been attempting to teach in this course. A lot of the course material you'll have to read on your own, which is an expectation of the college level experience and education. But I do try to go through quite a bit in terms of discussions of your course textbook, as well as relating information to material throughout the YouTube playlist that I've developed for this course. That being said, you'll want to look at the directions for your writing assignment as soon as possible if you've not done so already. And note that I do expect you to cite and discuss a relevant video or set of videos from the course playlist that will serve as your real-world example of the concepts that you discuss. So if we move into your textbook material, hopefully by now you understand that we're using two different texts. One is more appropriate for the 100 level course, that would be David Newman's text, and the other one chosen for this course is more of a junior senior level textbook, that would be George Ritzer's Globalization, the Essentials. So this course is about globalization, but it's from the sociological perspective. So I want you to understand what that perspective is. It has a lot to do with the sociological imagination. These are technically different terms, the sociological imagination and the sociological perspective, but essentially they mean the same thing. It's the ability to see society in terms of its component parts, or what we would call social structure. So this is covered in depth in chapter 2, as well as in chapter 9. So at this point, I hope that you've read through the material that I have for you in the Newman chapter 2 packet, which includes the end of chapter material for chapter 1 in the book, which is basic information about 3 concepts: sociology, the sociological imagination, and individualistic perspectives that you'd find in psychology, or perhaps in like common sense notions of why people do what they do. So psychologically, we would explain why individuals behave they do, because they have brains in our heads and we use them to think up thoughts, and we have motivations. But sociologically, like we'd look at something like genocide and look at the social structure of the situation, of any situation. And so we would look at how it is that society is composed of different features that are relatively stable over time. Those stable features we would call social statics, or these social forces that don't really change. So things like social institutions and organizations and groups. And then we would look at the dynamics, like the processes of interactions and the unfolding of what is possibly a world culture that we're moving into, what we call globalization. So at the more micro level, you have statuses and roles and groups that we engage in our everyday affairs of social life. But as we move on up into the macro level of social reality, we can start to look at organizations and social institutions as things in and of themselves. So the family structure across societies, Or how about organizations within the economy, like multinational corporations or businesses that can be passed down from generation to generation, like small family businesses, or multinational corporations like, for example, Walmart, that are larger than the country of the Bahamas, for example. If you calculate it up, Walmart employs more people than there are Bahamians. The Walmarts that exist take up more landmass than the Bahamas takes up. And the revenue, the profit of Walmart is larger than the GDP of the Bahamas. You can check those facts out for yourself and let me know if I'm incorrect. I'm not, though. So if we just check those facts real quick, we can go to the CIA fact book and look up some basic facts about the Bahamas, including people and society. So that'd be relevant for a sociology course. In 2024, estimated population of 410,000 people, so almost 411,000 people. If we look up the economy, then the real GDP, so the purchasing power parity, as they call it, $13 billion. So, it's quite a bit of money for a economy of 410,000 people. Walmart, on the other hand, in fiscal year 2023, had a revenue of 610 billion. So compare that to, again, 13 billion. And Walmart employs approximately 2.1 million associates. And again, the Bahamas has a population of 410,000 people. So there are some corporations on the planet as organizational structures that are larger than entire nation states. Makes an interesting world for us sociologists to study in terms of the social statics and dynamics that go into the processes that have led up to these types of structures existing in our world. So sociologists are going to be interested in major social structures like organizations and social institutions. And we have key social institutions like family, education, economy, politics and law, religion. Those are our big five social institutions: family, religion, education, government, or as it's labeled here, politics and law, or as we'll call it, the state, and the economy or economics or the market. There are dozens of social institutions like mass media, medicine and healthcare, military, science, sports, leisure, technology, transportation, communication, et cetera, et cetera. What you need to know basically is that social institutions are enduring patterns of social life that meet society's basic needs. Note that we're not saying meet individuals' basic needs. We're saying that these are the building blocks of societies. So societies and social structures outlast and exist before any individual exists on the planet. That's why we can't really have an individualist explanation of society because, well, individual humans come and go all the time in terms of being born and dying. Yet patterns like family, religion, education, government, and economy persist with or without particular individuals. Of course, society needs people, just like forests need trees. But forests don't need particular trees to continue being a forest, just like societies don't need particular people to continue being societies. And it's actually kind of difficult to wipe out entire societies. And it's been attempted throughout history, such as illustrated in the story of the genocide of the Tutsis by the Hutus, and several other genocidal attempts or attempts at ethnic cleansing of the removal of groups of people. There tend to be kind of remnants, some small groups of people who are left over who carry on the heritage of their nation or of their ethnic group or religious group or their social groups otherwise. So that's really kind of a key feature of this idea of social structures like organizations and institutions, is that they're not just building blocks of society, they're enduring patterns. So again, keep in mind that there are many, many different types of organizations that tend to carry out the functions or the purposes of any given social institution. There are a lot more organizations than there are social institutions. There are fewer cultures than there are social institutions, because you can think of it in a couple of different ways. Culture is the most pervasive element of a society. It's a word that we use to define a society. So there are many different societies across the planet with their own social institutions. So we can kind of think of this in a couple of ways. Like one, we can think of social structure just generally across the planet as it would exist anywhere. So you have culture, social institutions, organizations, groups, statuses, and roles, and that just exists anywhere. But we really want to particularize our thinking in terms of the society that we're looking at, because the way that a culture forms its language or symbols or architecture or clothing styles or cuisines or daily norms and the values that people establish within a society differentiate societies. So when we get to discussing globalization, we're really interested in the process of the world becoming more interconnected in terms of two social institutions in particular. Those would be economics and politics, as well as culture. Again, the most pervasive element or aspect of any society, the way of life of a society. So keep in mind that there are a couple of key components when we define societies, and that it's a large population of people who share a geography, a territory, a kind of common identity, as well as a governing body that typically has some type of ownership or claim to the territory that a society shares in terms of its geography. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is, in terms of globalization, is this idea of interdependence or interconnectedness, as the word is here. So we have these key terms, these I words: interconnectedness, interdependence, interrelatedness, integration. This idea that in a society, all the different component parts, culture, social institutions, organizations, groups, statuses, and roles, they're all interrelated like a human body. And that's a particular way of looking at society, or the perspective that we use. So overall, we're using our sociological imagination, our sociological perspective in this course. We're not thinking psychologically. We're not thinking about individuals. So in this course, we want to develop our sociological imagination or perspective generally, but we can refine it specifically to look at the social world or society around us in particular ways, or through specific lenses. For this course, since we're looking at a broad scale macro level phenomenon, we want to think about the structural functionalist and the conflict perspectives. Now, at times, these can complement each other, as stated here. They can both be used to look at the structures or the elements or aspects of society at large that lead to the daily processes that we experience at the micro level when we interact with other real live human beings. But structural functionalism is much more well suited at analyzing what are called the manifest and latent functions of organizations and institutions. The question is basically this: what is the purpose of that component of society that we're interested in studying? That's the basic essential question. It's like thinking about your heart, or thinking about your brain, or thinking about your lungs, like a complex system, much like a living organism. So what is the purpose of the heart? It's to pump blood. So you have to have veins that are connected to the heart. Well, why is it pumping blood? Because the blood has oxygen in it that it gets from the lungs. And so how do your lungs get oxygen? Well, we have muscles in your diaphragm that pull against your skeletal system. And so all of these, the integrated, interconnected, interdependent, interrelated systems work together to maintain the homeostasis or the equilibrium of the entire organism. So the structural functionalist perspective says basically that things that exist or persist in society. So here you see sociologist Robert Merton, 1957. Here you see Durkheim, 1915, the updated edition in 1954. Durkheim was a founding kind of structural functionalist. Robert Merton was definitely a structural functionalist, along with Talcott Parsons and Neil Smelser, who published a book together. Those are kind of some of the common names that you'll see associated with this school of structural functionalism. And you'll see this name Kingsley Davis, or K. Davis, again in chapter 10. So in chapter 10, page 183, we have another analysis of a feature of society called social stratification. And this is through both of our macro level lenses, because stratification is a macro level phenomenon of society. So it's both a static and a dynamic feature of society. static in the way that we can define societies as class systems, estate or feudal systems, caste or slavery systems. And I don't know why, but in the book, they don't want to discuss the stratification systems of socialist and communist societies. I have my suspicions of why that is, but we can save that for another time. So in the structural functionalist view of stratification, what we're thinking about is what Davis and Moore in 1945 imagined as the functional differential distribution of resources. So why is it that different occupations and professions have different amounts of prestige or income associated with them? Like, why is it that garbage collectors have lower incomes and lower prestige than physicians? If we let garbage pile up everywhere, then we would have very unhygienic and unsanitary public environments, which can easily lead to widespread communicable diseases, and that have led to fairly serious consequences throughout history, such as like the bubonic plague is the prime example. Partly this has to do with how much education it takes to achieve these various occupational statuses. So the position within the economy in terms of the careers or the jobs that we have. And just think about like what a career or a job is structural functionally. It's a status position that we have that carries out a needed purpose in society. There's some demand for some job because we got to eat, we got to clothe ourselves, we have to have housing and transportation and all these different sort of institutional aspects of carrying out the real material processes that allow us all to live and achieve our goals. So Davis and Moore said, well, the more time and energy and effort that it takes to put into the skill acquisition or the education to perform an occupation, the higher the reward should be, because you should have an incentive to go to school for 6, 8, 10, 12 years, however long it takes to become a neurosurgeon, a heart surgeon, or just a physician, or in my case, a PhD level academic. And so that would take a requisite amount of incentive to convince people that it's worth their while because there's a reward, there's a payoff for it. But this kind of logic breaks down a little bit, where if you think about celebrities like Taylor Swift or, you know, whoever the kind of newest celebrity is, getting paid millions and millions and millions of dollars, whereas, you know, educational professionals such as myself or grade school or high school teachers are making sometimes like 1% or sometimes, you know, 10% of what some celebrity is making. And is there really this functional need for celebrities as compared to educational professionals? Well, it depends upon how you look at this, because that criticism itself is coming from the conflict perspective. It's coming from this person in 1953, Tuman, and I'm forgetting his first name at this point, but in the 50s and 60s, there was a introduction of Marxian and Marxist thinking from the conflict perspective that criticized the structural functionalist perspective. So you'll notice here that Newman has an entire page dedicated to the conflict perspective's introduction, whereas he has about the same amount dedicated to the structural functionalist perspective in total. Then he goes on to discuss two different versions of the Marxian or Marxist model. So the Marxian class model and the neo-Marxist models. So about the same amount for the introduction to the conflict perspective as the entire structural functionalist perspective, then two versions of Marxian theories before a third conflict perspective. So this is for a couple different reasons. One is a lot of contemporary sociologists subscribe to some version of Marxian theory, whether it's the classical model that says that our class position is related to the means of production. You're either a proletariat or a worker or a bourgeoisie or a capitalist, and that defines your class position. The neo-Marxists said, well, you know, there can be a lot of contradictory class locations, such as like a university professor who allegedly has a high amount of prestige and not as much income as, say, like a celebrity. So celebrities, for some reason, are celebrated so immensely that they have a large amount of income coming from the roles they take or the performances in a game or in a movie or a theatrical show or something, along with their sponsorships, because they can lend some of their celebrity status to the commodity that they're selling. So these contradictory class locations became a part of the neo-Marxist model. And this also has to do with the amount of authority that an individual has relative to their status position. So like a university professor like myself might have some relatively more prestige than a garbage collector or a custodian. And I might have some relative amount of authority when it comes to grades or marking papers or something like that. But I have, little to no authority in the political world or in the economic world. Now, if I were an expert in a given field, in which I am, I should probably be seen as an authority in that particular field, especially if I can back up my arguments with facts and evidence and data, and I can provide a logical or coherent, theoretically informed explanation. So that would give me some credibility or authority in a position, but I don't have much political authority. I can't make laws and enforce laws. I don't necessarily own a business and can make hiring and firing decisions or something like that. So the neo-Marxians said, well, things are a little bit more complicated than just this dichotomy or bifurcation of this class model based upon whether or not you own the means of production. So sometimes you might hear about like a Marxian or Marxist perspective or a neo-Marxian or neo-Marxist models and theories. I even recently heard somebody say that neo-Marxism is just a right-wing conspiracy theory, which is absurd to me, considering that we have them in our standard sociology textbooks. And Karl Marx is a staple figure of standard introductory sociology and is replete in the entire field. Karl Marx is introduced right here on page 26 in the Newman textbook and in the Ritzer textbook on page 5. So in the Ritzer textbook, the first classical sociological theorist or social theorist that is cited is Karl Marx. Marx's ideas have been taken up by many neo-Marxists, such as Zygmunt Bauman in his theories of liquid modernity. And if we look to page 144 in the Ritzer textbook, which is a part of your assigned readings for the midterm exam, we can see that neo-Marxian theories are discussed in terms of or associated with the Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School developed the critical theory that was a part of what we call neo-Marxism or neo-Marxian theories. Now, what they're concerned about is that societies are being engineered from above. So you can see globalization from above is concerned with the roles of the nation state and the multinational corporation. These are our two main organizational structures that we're interested in terms of globalization. So if you think back to Newman, who in chapter 9 is indicating that organizations and social institutions are our two main social structures that we need to think about in terms of studying globalization, we then further need to really think about what types of organizations or what specific organizations or social institutions should we look at? And as I've indicated in previous lectures, he covers 3 social institutions in chapter 9, which are economics, education, and religion. Now, it's kind of odd because, again, he defines globalization as the increasingly interconnected world in terms of economics, politics, culture, and the environment. So I wonder why he doesn't include politics. Well, I think the answer is because he's much more focused on the economic structures because he's taking that Marxian perspective as opposed to Max Weber's perspective that focused on bureaucracies and the state. So going back to page 144 in Ritzer, we can see that this idea of globalization from above, where there are these organizations carrying out the functions for social institutions. In the case of economics, it's the multinational corporation. In case of politics, it's the nation state, more precisely the state that is the governing force of a society in a geographic region, which we would call a country. But again, we're thinking a little bit more clearly in terms of societies, nations, the state or government, cultures, civilizations, and these key concepts that we have throughout the pages that I've indicated you need to study for the midterm exam. So in a previous lecture on pages 108 and 109, I discussed the difference between a nation and a state, the nation states, and then we have these ideas of national identity and nationalism. So how is it that people in a society come to think of themselves as a member of an in-group in terms of the organizational structure of the state or the nation state? And that's primarily through the educational and media forces that disseminate information, such as like tying people's identity to symbols like flags or rituals of singing the national anthem and things of that nature. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing depends upon your worldview, your guiding theories, your set of beliefs and basic assumptions, your values, your ideology. One way we can think about this in sociological terms is more or less in terms of structural functionalism or versions of the conflict perspective. Because remember, the conflict perspective isn't just like one whole total thing. There are Marxian, neo-Marxian, Weberian, even feminist and critical race theories that are a part of the whole constellation of conflict theories. But essentially, if you think that people's statuses and roles in groups and organizations that we function within are here, and the purpose is to carry out daily life so that we can help other people achieve our daily goals and cooperate and live in harmony together, more or less, then it's more of a structural functionalist point of view. And you might think that the nation state then has the purpose of defending individuals internally and externally and making sure that contracts are upheld and things like that. But there are a couple other different points of view. And one of those is discussed in chapter 9. This is at the beginning of this section on page 166, extending into 167 on the structure of formal organizations, most notably the bureaucracy, which is discussed by my main man, Max Weber. So Max Weber, as you might see it, but it's pronounced Weber, discusses bureaucracies as these iron cages that end up dehumanizing individuals within the elaborate set of rules and the impersonal nature of people being fired and basically treated as functionaries of the organizational apparatus rather than as living beings with their own hopes and dreams and desires and goals. And you might be treated like that insofar as it benefits the organization in terms of helping the oligarchy or the small group of people at the top controlling the organization in the hierarchy of authority and the division of labor. So this can exist in the form of multinational corporations, of nation states, of the state and government, of religious organizations, of educational organizations. It's just bureaucracies are very generalized structures that organizations tend to take the form of because they're the most functional way of achieving large-scale goals. So Weber said that bureaucracies are functional for society. He stressed that they're functional. So you might think that Max Weber is a structural functionalist. And to some degree, he said that, yeah, this kind of domination and dehumanization and iron cage that bureaucracies produced is functional for carrying out large-scale goals in society, but in consequence, it's leading to some inequalities in the hierarchies that form and the ability for the oligarchy or the people at the top to dominate people at the bottom. Now, this becomes especially true in terms of the institution of politics and law, as it's stated in Newman, or as we would more accurately call it from Ritzer, the state. Now, I think I've stated before that the state should be more accurately defined in terms of Max Weber's classic definition, which you can find in various books and places on the internet. But essentially, Weber was indicating that the state is the ultimate authority in society because it holds the monopoly or the sole ownership over the legitimate use of force and coercion. So when laws are made, at the root, essentially, it's a coercive act. Every law implies that violence will be used to uphold that law. So you have the state, and then you have the nation, or you have the rest of society. And the nation is most similar to what we would call society, because that's the people, it's the heritage, it's where culture exists. But we also have civil society. So civil society is kind of like the nation, kind of like just society in general, though we really want to parse it out from this idea of the state, because civil society is where all of our voluntary interactions take place. So anything that's totally based upon the will of the people, free will, autonomy, agency, consent is what we might term civil society. So this is really where religion or fraternal organizations and occupations and jobs and economic interactions, anything that is just the willing, voluntary cooperation, association, participation of people in society. Now, because George Ritzer takes a neo-Marxian perspective, he's going to discuss that in terms of, as you can see here, Marx and Engels, and then lead you up to a discussion of Italian thinker, Marxist, neo-Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who was one of the first neo-Marxists that really came about to make a distinction between the market and civil society. Now that's a Marxian perspective, because they're gonna have an economic analysis that says that capitalism and markets are inherently exploitative, and therefore you have civil society in the markets. So structural functionalists, Weberians, people like Alexis de Tocqueville are going to think more in lines of the way that I see things, which is that civil society is the area of life in which individuals negotiate, argue, struggle against, or agree with each other and with those in authority through voluntary cooperative means. And that would be the needed or necessary addition. So up to this point, you can probably get the idea that I don't necessarily agree with much of what Ritzer has to say, because, for example, I don't know why he's not using a Weberian definition of the state in his chapter when he discusses this. So he says it's the organizational structure outside other socioeconomic hierarchies with relatively autonomous office holders. Weber is the classic source of the definition of the state for most sociologists. Ritzer definitely knows who Weber is. He based one of his major theories on Weber. So I really don't know why he didn't choose to use Weber's definition, but I suspect it has something to do with the same reason why, for example, Newman will discuss Max Weber in terms of bureaucracy, as well as the role of bureaucracy in governments that engage in several latent functions or unintended consequences with very negative or dysfunctional consequences for society, and defines globalization in terms of politics and economics, but then wants to talk about economics so much that he discusses it here and then again in chapter 10. My suspicion is that Newman, like Ritzer, is taking the Marxian conflict perspective. Notice that in chapter 10, Weber is introduced under the conflict perspective, but he's not introduced here. So these are some clues that kind of indicate to me what the biases of both of the authors are, that Ritzer introduces you to Marx in chapter 1, Newman introduces you to Marx in chapter 2, and chapter 2 in Ritzer, he's going to lead you to, in chapter 2 in Ritzer, he's going to lead you to these neo-Marxian theories that we'll look into at a later time. In chapter 10 in Newman, he discusses two different Marxian models of the conflict perspective, and one of Weber's models. Notice he doesn't discuss feminist theory or critical race theory when it comes to conflict theories of stratification. So again, these are, to me, some of the biases that exist within these textbooks. If anybody's interested in this, I can send you some articles that discuss biases within sociology textbooks. But for now, you can see what it is that I'm trying to point out to you, just in case you are concerned about the source of information that you're getting. So let's return here at the end of the lecture to page 144 in Ritzer and just think a little bit more clearly about why it is that some people might be concerned about top-down engineering of society. So this idea of globalization from above, where a few of the more powerful nation states or more wealthy and powerful multinational corporations would have much more influence and say over the direction that the world is heading. Have you ever thought about news media or entertainment as a source of propaganda? Have you ever heard of the culture industry? Well, according to the Frankfurt School and the Critical School, the culture industry is the way that society is engineered ideologically. This goes back to the classic idea proposed by Marx and Engels of false consciousness, where the idea is that people don't revolt against the systems that are oppressing them because they have a false consciousness about their interests in the system that is dominating their lives. So, taken up by the neo-Marxists in the Frankfurt School, who propose that the culture industry is producing ideologies and false consciousness that lead people to be either distracted from or misunderstand their current situations, is really an extension of propaganda studies. So propaganda is the dissemination of information, typically for a purpose designed to influence or persuade people, or to kind of trick us into thinking one thing rather than another, or of ignoring some things rather than other things. So for the critical theorists and the neo-Marxians, the capitalist monopoly over the means of information dissemination is of real concern because, well, they want to own the means of dissemination of information. So, for example, they're in your textbook, like in Newman and Ritzer. I'll give you a challenge. If the state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of force and violence, one wonders if other competing monopolies can exist in society. Have there ever been true capitalistic monopolies? You can see the debates and discussions in this section for more on that. Okay, so when we pick up next time, we'll look more into this idea of homogeneous products and the global to glocal scale discussed in chapter 7 as it relates to globalization from above and globalization from below. Because really the question for globalization is, how is it occurring? How is it unfolding? And the conclusion that most social scientists and sociologists would reach is really very similar to how Newman introduces you to information in chapter 2. And that's that individuals structure society and influence each other in our everyday lives, and that there's larger social structural forces that shape our own lives. So there's this back and forth that goes on in terms of the unfolding of society within a geographic territory and among the people who share a culture, as well as the interactions that occur between societies in terms of globalization. So we'll pick up from there next time.